The Roman forces were beset on all sides. The center was struggling to hold back the tide of barbarians, while the left was being engulfed by overwhelming forces. On the far right of the battlefield, Valens and his guard units looked on in horror. The vexations of cavalry held firm, only to see more reinforcing enemy cavalry stream onto the field and begin to form opposite their position. Horses whinnied as the screams continued and arrows began to fall amongst the men. One trooper lost his nerves and pulled back. Soon more and more of the men were unable to rein in their terrified horses or their own fear. Panic gripped the cavalry, and even the Imperial Guard began to break off in a panicked retreat. Valens attempted to salvage this situation, but could barely be heard above the din of battle. Streams of murderous arrows continued to fly through the air. Thick smoke masked their approach. Men were dropping in their hundreds now. Ammianus tells us, quote, that it was scarcely possible to see the sky, which resounded with horrible cries, and in consequence, the darts, which were bearing death on every side, reached their mark and fell with deadly effect, because no one could see them beforehand so as to guard against them. End quote. The Roman line was convulsing under the stress as the bodies piled up and the pressure on the left intensified. Groups of men broke off, then whole units. Hampered by the piles of corpses, the exhausted troops were unable to regroup. Only in the center was there a semblance of hope. Here, too, Roman legions stood unflinchingly in the face of death. Both of these were the elite Palatina units. One was the Mattiari Legion, and the other the Lanciari Legion, of spear-armed foot lancers. Valens sought shelter with these units as the Imperial force eroded quickly around this last bastion of men. The Emperor called for the immediate deployment of the reserve troops. These were the Batavian Auxiliaries, yet another elite Palatina force. Victor, the master of horse, was sent to fetch the famously tough reservists who were stationed to the rear. He and his guard cut through the Goths, making their way with all haste. However, all that occupied their designated position was dusty, empty ground. The final hope for the army had fled. Fear and the adrenaline of battle could only hold the remaining Romans together for so long. Thirst, hunger, and exhaustion would come rushing on to seize the endurance of the weaker men. These either failed to lift their shields against the next barbarian sword blow, or had just enough energy to stagger back a few feet, only to be cut down anyways. They were butchered as they slipped on the blood-soaked ground. The Goths kept up the onslaught, but may have started to suffer equally from the conditions. However, families from the camp could surely have helped bring water and rations down to their men below. The Goths may have drawn on provisions from the nearby camp to restore their health and renew the fighting, while the Romans had no such opportunity. The battle at Adrianople raged all afternoon and continued as the sun began to set. We are bleakly reminded by Ammianus how, quote, the barbarians, their eyes blazing with frenzy, were pursuing our men, in whose veins the blood was chilled with numb horror. Some fell without knowing who struck them down, others were buried beneath the mere weight of their assailants. Some were slain by the sword of a comrade, for though they often rallied, there was no ground given, nor did anyone spare those who retreated. End quote. This was the hellish panic that awaited an army in flight. It was only by the grace of darkness that the slaughter let up. A black, moonless night drew a curtain on one of the greatest slaughters in recent Roman history. No more than a third of the Imperial force was able to make its way home. Casualties were massive. The roads, the fields, the ditches, the hills, all were choked with the dead and dying. Ammianus solemnly recounts how the, quote, mounds of fallen horses filled the plains with corpses, end quote. 35 tribunes were cut to pieces along with most of the senior generals. The emperor himself was never seen again, either dead or alive. And like that, in one summer afternoon, quote, an entire army vanished like a shadow, end quote. The repercussions of what had just happened would ripple through the empire. Militarily alone, this was a massive setback. The bulk of the Eastern Army had been destroyed, and with it, many of the officers. These were not just military men, but also senior administrators and officials. Their deaths equated to the elimination of a large percentage of the government bureaucracy. The Roman world was shell-shocked. Victorious Goths would go unopposed, further ravaging the Balkans. This would wipe out agricultural produce and erode the imperial tax base in the region. Finding the resources to revive the imperial army would be even harder now. More importantly was the precedent set by the massacre at Adrianople. The illusion of Roman invulnerability was shattered. As we have seen, this would only incite further attacks, and following the battle, more barbarians swarmed to meet Fritigern. Gratian could do nothing in the face of this disaster and retreated back to the west. The east was left in a terrible panic. Roman armies had been beaten by barbarians before, but never like this. Adrianople was different. The humiliation at Adrianople had been administered on Roman territory by an army that had nowhere else to go. A migrating Gothic nation would now be a permanent force within the walls of the empire. This fact would be the defining feature of the Roman world moving forward. While the Goths were unable to take walled cities such as Adrianople or Constantinople, they continued to operate within the Roman Empire as a unified force. Theodosius, master of horse, was appointed as emperor after the death of Valens. He set to work rebuilding the army, but it would take over 6 long years of sustained campaigns to whittle the Goths down. Slowly, parts of their army were defeated or had deals cut to settle them in the empire. Finally, the remaining Goths came to term in 382 and were settled in Thrace along the Danube. However, they would retain their own leadership and may have enjoyed a degree of local autonomy. Adrianople made possible the precedent for future barbarian national settlement inside the Roman Empire. This would provide political alternatives to Roman leadership itself in regions where imperial authority waned. Such trends would lead to the collapse of the empire as a solitary political state. One commentator notes that in this way, the Roman Empire would, quote, delegate itself out of existence, end quote. The true frailty of the Roman world had been unmasked at Adrianople. The punishment of the Goths would be nothing compared to that of the flail of God who would soon be bearing down on Europe. Attila and his Huns were coming.